Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I must say, for once, I find myself in the unusual position of debating legislation that I'm actually not looking to reject out of hand, and I have to admit I broadly welcome most of the measures in this bill, particularly CCS and hydrogen models. Although that said, I do have to put in record my objection to all the comments that are made about nuclear there. Nuclear is the only energy technology that's got more expensive over the years rather than cheaper. So this talking about nuclear making our bills less expensive is just collective madness, and we need to move away from that. And the talk, Mr Deputy Speaker, about small modular reactors, the reality is there's not even a design approved for implementation yet for SMRs, so I don't know how they're going to judge this competition when we don't have an approved design for SMRs, and the one that's going through that process is still going to be at least another 18 months, as I understand it. Now, one more thing about this bill that I can't get my head round is the fact that the so-called revising chamber was deemed the place to bring forward this bill, which seems counterintuitive to me. But what I would say to the Secretary, if the Lords, another place, was the place that was deemed most appropriate to bring forward that legislation, then surely we're going to have trust in them with the 5 amendments that were brought into this bill, and will and should continue to keep these amendments within the bill. And just for the record, Mr Deputy Speaker, I do support the 5 Lords amendments. Now, firstly, the amendment preventing any new coal mines being opened by the Coal Authority or its successors makes sense if we're going to be serious about net zero. We can't have the hypocrisy of lecturing developing countries about the use of coal while considering extracting coal ourselves. We can't have the hypocrisy of Tory MPs decrying Germany for using coal while at the same time supporting the new Cumbrian coal mine. And we need to end the pretence of a zero-emission coal mine by ignoring the fact that embedded carbon in the coal that will be burned, that somehow ignore the emissions from the burning of the coal. And we need to end the hypocrisy of arguing for indigenous coal for steel coke in the UK when the coal is broadly not suitable for that, and 84% of that coal is going to be exported for burning elsewhere. Now, in terms of the amendment to ensure that meeting the UK's net zero targets becomes a specific part of Ofgem's general responsibilities, that's just plain common sense. We had a number of interventions supporting that, and it's actually part of the Skidmore Review recommendations. It's also been called for by wider industry, including Energy UK, Renewables UK, the Climate Change Committee, the National Infrastructure Commission, and groups such as the Green Alliance. But logically, you'd say if the government does object to Ofgem having a net zero mandate, then it sends a signal they're not actually serious about doing everything they can to meet net zero. And when is the government ever going to publish their long-delayed strategy and policy statement for Ofgem? For too long, it seems to me, the government likes to suggest that Ofgem should have responsibility for policy considerations whenever any awkward questions arise. But it's quite clear it's the responsibility of government to set policy decisions for Ofgem within their strategy and policy statement. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, for years now I've went on about the unfair transmission grid charging system, one that penalises Scottish sites where there is actually the best load factor and wind resource. Instead, as reconfirmed by the Green Alliance, the current system, overseen by Ofgem, favours electricity coming from Europe rather than wind farms built in the UK's windiest areas. And they've highlighted that, on average, EU electricity generators paid 16 times less in transmission charges to send their energy to England last year compared to actually bringing the energy down from Scotland. In its fair words, that Scottish generators are now at a significant disadvantage compared to sites in France, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Denmark and Norway. So what kind of perverse logic is this? But even worse is the reality that National Grid ESO confirmed that £4.6 billion was paid in constraint payments last year, mainly due to this lack of grid capacity between Scotland and England. So if ever there is an example of lack of strategy and forward thinking between the government and the regulator, then this is it. Paying wind farm developers to stop generating because of lack of grid capacity, while at the same time then paying fossil fuel generators to ramp up gas generation to meet the demand, or importing from the continent at the same time. It's actually madness, and these constraint payments could easily have covered the cost of grid upgrades. Now, as well as the need for grid build-out to facilitate renewable energy targets, The government needs to look and listen to industry when they're talking about if we're looking to deploy renewable energy, need to listen to industry about the pressures of inflation and how they're going to struggle to meet the strike rates that's been suggested for AR Round 5, and indeed some of the biggest developers that the Secretary mentioned are actually struggling to deliver their AR4 commitments. So we need to learn from what happened at the Spanish auction, which is a complete failure, and actually listen to industry and make sure that that doesn't happen as we try to deploy renewable energy as quick as possible. Now, there is a reality that the government's own offshore wind champion highlighted that the government is going to, even so, the government is going to be well short of their 2030 target of 50 gigawatt of offshore wind. And they need to look at revising the first-come, first-served ability to hold on to grid consents, which is a prize that companies hold on to. And we need to move away from that system and again allow access to the grid for companies that can deploy quickly. And Mr Deputy Speaker, while the government talks rightly about speeding up consent processes in England and Wales through the planning system, we need to make sure that Scotland's not left behind. Now, contact's been made by to the Department from the Scottish Government, and I'm sure he understands that while Scottish ministers have responsibility for sign-off of planning consents for major infrastructure projects, the regulations themselves are reserved to Westminster under Section 36 of the 1989 Electricity Act, and we really do need to work together to get these regulations revised so that Scotland does not get left behind and that we do have control of the planning and consent process and can actually speed up that process as well. Now, several bodies, including Energy UK and the Climate Change Committee, have also called on the Government to apply a net zero test to all policy, regulatory spending and taxation decisions. And I'd support this as well, because we really need to move away from silo working and have a joined-up net zero policy right across all government departments. Now, I suggest that the UK Government also should learn from the Scottish Government in terms of the setting up of a Just Transition Commission to have fairness and long-term job creation and transfer at the forefront of net zero, and I call on the UK Government once more to match the Scottish Government's £500 million Just Transition funding. Now, another Lord's amendment I support is that about community energy, and as a co-sponsor of the local electricity bill, it makes sense that I do support the suggested change to provide a framework to support the growth of a community and smaller scale electricity export guarantee scheme. It's been supported by Community Energy Scotland, and overall 318 MPs now support the local electricity bill, including 125 backbench Conservative MPs, so more than enough to win a vote in this House. The concept is also supported by over 110 local authorities, including my own East Ayrshire Council, as well as over 80 national organisations. And Power for the People deserve the most credit for getting their campaign to this stage. It's estimated that community energy generation could grow between 12 and 20-fold in size over a decade. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, that could see up to 10% of electricity being generated by community-owned projects. And so if we do facilitate this, we're facilitating additional investment that provides returns for communities. Building better network resilience with these small schemes that are actually scattered across the grid. And of course that then is far better value for money than paying £70 billion or so for 2 large-scale nuclear power stations. And according to Power for the People, in 2021, community energy groups spent over £500,000 in energy efficiency upgrades, helping 21,000 people reduce their energy bills, and as well as that, nearly 60,000 individuals were also engaged in energy efficiency initiatives. So, of course, this means reducing future energy demand for the entire system, and it's quite clear that community schemes that reinvest returns is actually a virtuous circle. Now, past policy that was successful as well, Mr Deputy Speaker, was the feed-in tariff, which was successful about getting deployment of small-scale generation projects, particularly for small-scale hydro in Scotland. Now, the work, proven technology in hydro lasts for decades, so that's why we need some sort of price uncertainty for such generation going forward. Some form of export price guarantee which could reinvigorate hydro schemes around the 5 megawatt capacity as delivered by companies across the Scottish Highlands like the Green Highlands Company. It makes no sense for them to have reached maximum efficiency and expertise in terms of designers and contracts, and then to have the plug pulled completely from under the feet, and that expertise possibly getting lost going forward. And while we talk about route to market, Mr Deputy Speaker, I have to put on record again the plea that we find a way forward for pump storage hydro. I was very disappointed that the Network Minister in front of the Scottish Parliament Committee said this won't happen any time soon. This is technology that can be deployed right now. It can be deployed fast. It's proven technology, and we really should be moving forward on it. Now, turning to energy efficiency, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Secretary once again was boasting that properties rated EPC or above have increased from 14% of stock to 47% since 2010. So yes, that is progress, but it's progress based on addressing these as homes first. And clearly, if they've only addressed 33% of stock in 13 years, it means quite clearly they're never going to meet their target for completing the rest of the 3% by the 2035 target. Yeah, I'm happy to give way.
On that issue, thanks very much. Just on the issue of energy efficiency that my honourable friends are mentioning, is he as concerned as I am that there was no mention of strengthening minimum energy efficiency standards in the bill, but there were measures to create powers for the Secretary of State to remove European performance of buildings regulation in the UK. Is he as concerned as I am about that?
I certainly share the concerns from my honourable friend, and it looks like this is another possible Brexit dividend in reverse, where we could end up falling behind European counterparts, because these regulations have helped drive forward standards in the UK. Now, if we return to the Government's efforts to upgrade stock and meet the 2035 target, we have to bear in mind that right now, as house building continues, new housing isn't being built to the correct energy efficiency standards. So, as time goes on at the moment, they're actually always increasing the number of retrofits that are required for the future. So that is completely illogical and needs addressed as soon as possible as well. And then, in terms of slippage of targets, simultaneously we're now finding that under the Eco4 scheme, energy companies are finding it really difficult to find homes that meet the criteria required for Eco4 upgrades, and they're struggling to hit targets. And it's quite clear the Government's going to have to revise costing proposals for this, or Eco4 is going to collapse completely. And of course that means the supply chain moves on and moves elsewhere, and it's hard to recover that progress. So I really urge the Secretary to have a rethink on that. And Mr Deputy Speaker, without action in housing and buildings, there is no plausible path to achieving the 5th carbon budget or meeting the 2030 statutory fuel poverty target. The reality is, right now we have about 7 million homes that are classed as being in fuel poverty. This is why energy efficiency does require a much greater urgency, especially also in the private rented sector. And on fuel poverty, now really is the time for a proper, fair social tariff. And I'd certainly be happy to support amendments in this area at committee stage. Now, if I turn to hydrogen production, there is no doubt hydrogen production is needed as part of the net zero pathway. It can provide fuels for shipping, for aviation, for HCVs, for example. Hydrogen is going to be vital for decarbonising some energy-intensive industries. However, there is now a growing cost reality that is extremely unlikely that hydrogen will be part of a large-scale domestic heat and switchover. Now, I have previously supported the H100 hydrogen trial in Fife, and I want to see that come to a conclusion. We need to have evidence-based, but more and more the reality is it does look too costly, and hydrogen is unlikely to be that solution. The low-carbon expert Jan Rosenau was a special advisor to the Bees Committee when we looked at heat decarbonisation, has identified and looked at 36 independent studies that do not predict or foresee any large-scale use of hydrogen for heating. And as for hydrogen blending, again I can see the arguments and the benefits of that as an interim measure to reduce the use of methane gas in our heating system. But again, more than 20 organisations have written to the Energy Secretary outlining that they believe it will be too expensive and it's just another burden on bill payers. Also, we need clarity in what the hydrogen levy is going to look like. Now, we know the Government was wanting to put it onto bill payers. What would that anticipated cost be to consumers? How can an additional levy in bills be justified at this juncture? And we look at France and Germany, who are investing heavily directly into hydrogen development, and we've got the Inflation Reduction Act in the States. The actual levy proposal that the government had means the UK government will just fall further behind. Now, another aspect I've got concerns about, and I did raise this with the Secretary, is the fact that it does look like there's a clause in the bill that could allow forcible disconnection from the gas network to facilitate these hydrogen trials. It's really important we do not go down the route of forcing people to disconnect, because that is no way to get the public on side. And Mr Deputy Speaker, if we look at lack of joined-up thinking with the government again, the government have said they've got aspirations of hydrogen blending, but yet the current health and safety regulations have a maximum limit of 2% of hydrogen being allowed to be blended in the system. At the moment, there's no proposals to actually change that legislation. So again, the government's own targets can't actually be met because they've got other legislation that needs to be changed to make that happen. If I turn to carbon capture and storage, of course, I do welcome the enabling legislation for the licensing and funding models, which, to be fair, is long overdue. But it's quite clear, although this is enabling legislation, there's no definitive models proposed yet. There's also no clear funding pathways. We've got the £20 billion pledge a year from 2028, but there's no corresponding budget line for that. It's actually at the behest of a future government. And this government always tells you can't bind the hands of a successor government. So how they can guarantee this £20 billion a year a pledge is clearly at odds with what they say about binding future governments. And in the here and now, we still don't have certainty over the Track 2 timeline. So I'm asking the Secretary once again, when's Acorn going to get the backing it deserves? The Scottish Government's 2030 targets cannot be met without this, and without further CCS clusters, the UK will miss their own 2030 targets as well. And it's no surprise that the CCS Association has written to the Secretary outlining their concerns. And just to come to a conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, to turn to devolution, the bill is littered with the following comments. The Secretary of State must consult the Scottish Ministers if the regulations contain provision that would be within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament if it were contained in an Act of that Parliament. The requirement only to consult is frankly not good enough. The UK Government should be seeking to work with and obtain permission of the Scottish Government where it's a devolved competency as an absolute minimum. This is another example of a power grab because it's there in the bill instead of collegiate working. So I really ask the Secretary to think again this, because it's outrageous that 29 clauses have this wording. And that's a direct opposite of what I was saying earlier on about the need to revise Section 36 of the 1989 Act to ensure that Scottish Government or Scottish Parliament has got full competency in terms of planning, which should be a devolved matter. So these matters need addressed going forward. There's many matters that need addressed in a strategic overview, and certainly I'll be happy to work with the Government and also be bringing forward amendments at committee stage.
6 minutes, Chris.